It's news to none of you that art, by definition, is not utilitarian. You can be creative without being an artist, surely, but being creative doesn't make you an artist. You can't elide the difference between those two things. It just makes you ingenious. Creativity can be harnessed for business purposes, but the essence of creativity has nothing to do with commercial applications or monetizability or giving you the competitive edge or peak performance or utilitarian considerations of any sort.
Author, lecturer, critic, and culture jammer Mark Dery was the keynote speaker at Austin's ACTLab conference in June of this year. In this episode of the Plutopia podcast, Mark takes aim at the corporatized, algorithm-driven web, delirious urbanism, and much more. You may want to have a dictionary close by, since Mr. Dery does not cater to the monosyllabic.
Tonight's talk will run about an hour as we summit the Everest of my argument, so bring plenty of bottled oxygen. It's called Let's Get Lost, an experiment in controlled digression. Now, I took the title of the conference as a prompt, Reboot the Noösphere, Rewilding the Infinite Network. And I took this to mean reviving the dream of a felicitously deterritorialized, in the Deleuzian sense of the word, wild web, in contradistinction to today's corporatized, algorithm-driven web. I'd like to begin by talking about what I call delirious urbanism. So taking this prompt as a kind of a GPS for free association, I found myself thinking not only of the earlier pre-Zuckerberg, less commercial web, but also of the historical topos of wild nature and the avant-garde embrace in the 20th century of what might be called wild urbanity, the delirious urbanism of Baudelaire's Flaneur, of Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, and the Surrealist quest for the marvelous in the modern metropolis, paradigmatically Paris. Following the Surrealist lead, the Situationists poetically remapped the public spaces of Paris through the tactic they dubbed the dérive, literally adrift. The dérive is a determinedly directionless, but far from purposeless, stroll through city streets, wandering down dead-end alleys, around blind corners, whose acute angles conceal what? The drearily predictable, the jarringly unexpected, the Freudian uncanny behind the banal. These are Situationist maps of their psychogeographical reimagining of Paris. And psychogeography simply means that you map onto existing urban space, famous or neglected and untended and unfrequented, your own psychic reverberations, your own associations. You, to borrow a Freudian notion, cathect it with your own psychic energies, and it becomes an entirely new city in your mind. Politicizing Baudelaire's aloof, aristocratic connoisseur of the urban whirl, the dandified flaneur, as well as the surrealist nocturnal rambles in search of the marvelous, as they called it, the dérive is a more multi-layered concept than I'm suggesting here, but you get my drift. Unshackled from, that was charitable of you. Unshackled from work with me. Unshackled from the demands of work and even the laborious fun of leisure, the dérive disrupts the unitary urbanism imposed by capitalism on our experience of everyday life. In his introduction to a critique of urban geography, the situationist theorist Guy Debord champions the dérive as a dowsing rod for divining the evident division of a city into zones of distinct psychic atmospheres, for exposing, quote, the path of least resistance that is automatically followed in aimless rambles, and which has no relation to the physical contour of the terrain, and uncovering, quote, the appealing or repelling character of certain places, subliminal forces at play in the psychogeography of urban environments that can be, quote, discovered by careful analysis and turned to account. reinscribing the urban environment with their own idiosyncratic situations to create new psychogeographies of the radical imagination. The situationists reclaimed the city from consumer capitalism's society of the spectacle, in their dreams, at least. The dérive inspired the peregrinations of British psychogeographers. But these are the arcades of Paris, sort of prehistoric incarnations of the mall. They were the first covered malls in the late 19th century in the Belle Époque, and were still around in the 20s when Walter Benjamin visited them in Paris. And he was much taken with them, as were the Surrealists, and loved their dreamlike juxtaposition of gimcracks and tchotchkes and disused antiques and gaucheries and kitsch and camp of all sorts. And yeah, very, very much so. So the dérive inspired the peregrinations of British psychogeographers, such as Ian Sinclair, whose year-long explorations of the outskirts of the London orbital are chronicled in his book of the same name. Like depth psychologists, psychogeographers and their close cousins, urban explorers, and I understand there's a large contingent of urban explorers here in Austin, urban explorers who prowl abandoned amusement parks and insane asylums, who spelunk in catacombs and sewers. They're all drawn to the Freudian unconscious of the built environment, an urbanist idea of the Christavan abject, disused, unloved, and hitherto unnoticed liminal spaces, typically on the fringes of cities, edgelands, as the environmentalist Marion Shord calls them, quote, the interfacial interzone between urban and rural. Robert McFarlane, the nature writer, describes edgelands as, quote, the debatable space where city and countryside fray into one another. They comprise jittery, jumbled, broken ground, brownfield sites, utilities infrastructure, cracking substations and pallet depots, transit hubs, sewage farms, scrub forests, sluggish canals, allotments, retail parks, slackened regulatory frameworks, and guerrilla ecologies. Now, paralleling the real-world reconnaissance missions of psychogeographers and urban explorers are J.G. Ballard's elaborations in his science fictions of the here and now of an aesthetic that I'll call the urban abject. Ballard was one of very few novelists who drew our attention to the De Chirico-like mysteries and melancholy of the invisible architecture all around us. Invisible because of its dreary functionalism, a putative hostility to not only aesthetic considerations, but to human use, and even to the very notion of the human, architecture as social pathology. Narrating novels like Crash, High Rise, and Concrete Island, in a voice whose deadpan never cracked, Ballard was the ironic Wordsworth of freeway flyovers and concrete islands, brutalist tower blocks, multi-story garages, automobile graveyards, abandoned hotels with their inevitable drains, swimming pools, and Cape Canaveral launch towers and rocket gantries succumbing to the wounds of time like pharaonic monuments. If Britain ever erects a memorial to the poet laureate of post-human landscapes, let it be a deserted office park seen in perpetual night, its empty parking lot lit like a movie set by the cheerless glare of sodium vapor lights. I truly am among ACTLabbers. And it's a great feeling. Rewilding, uncanny forests. So let's consider the rewilding part of this proposition transposed into the original key of the arboreal uncanny. The notion of rewilding urges us to recover buried memories of the pre-modern wild, specifically the forest primeval. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines, and the walls became the world all around, from where the wild things are. As a Jungian archetype, the forest primeval is very possibly our master metaphor. It is buried deep in the collective unconscious of the human species. Early Roman histories of the tribes of Germania recount the incident where Caesar and his legions meets with the leader of all the tribes of Germania who have spent their entire lives under the arboreal canopy, so much so that it is legendarily claimed that the head of the tribes has never seen the sun. There's also a story that in ancient Britain, a squirrel could go from one side of England to the other without ever touching ground, leaping from branch to branch. Of course, this Jungian archetype is figured in other myths, fables, and fictions, from Dante's Dark Woods and the Inferno to the Brothers Grimm, famously, to Nathaniel Hawthorne's Gothic New England tale, Young Goodman Brown, to, of course, to the Blair Witch Project, in which the real evil, the real villain, is the trees, the forest, not the witch, just as it is in the extraordinary independent 2015 film, The Witch. And we see this image again in Reddit subgroups devoted to Ikakahara. You'll forgive my Japanese pronunciation. The suicide forest at the base of Mount Fuji, which has attracted a peculiar gothic, clammy, pallid fandom. Now, a Jungian pivot that just as nature teeters on the brink of extinction, it seems that the sort of wild wood is beginning to bulk large again in the public mind. We see this in Peter Wohllebens' odd book, The Hidden Life of Trees. Many of you may be familiar with this sort of German New Age forester who talks about things like the wood wide web, a phrase which should merit drawing and quartering and the strappado in my mind. So, you know, what worse fate than to be drowned in a bud of treacle? But in any event, he partakes of this sort of curious Teutonic mysticism that gave us von der Vogel and pre-Nazi naturism and Nazi naturism and Rudolf Steiner and the Waldorf schools and, of course, Wagnerian mysticism with shafts of sunlight coming down through the Black Forest at Bayreuth as the Nereids sylph around in the Rhine and all of that. So he's clearly got one foot in that. But he talks about the consciousness of trees in a way that has gotten him anointed by NPR and Oprah and that sort of thing. Rather closer to Earth, the naturalist Robert McFarlane mentions a pando, a clonal colony of quaking aspen trees in Utah that is conjoined by its roots into a genetically similar organism weighing 6 million kilograms and estimated to be 80,000 years old. Pando in the original Latin means eye spread out. More anti-anthropocentrically, the anthropologist Eduardo Cohn argues in his book, How Forests Think, Toward an Anthropology Beyond the Human, that trees have consciousness, that forests constitute a kind of a collective organism or a colonial organism. And this is oddly close to the flat ontology propounded by members of the Vogish school of philosophy known as object-oriented ontology, which is associated with what's called in contemporary philosophy the post-human turn, that is to say, an anti-anthropocentric attempt to philosophize outside the human point of view and with, as Da Vinci would say, man as the measure of all things, or person as the measure of all things. So at a moment when claims to human uniqueness are under siege on all sides by the latest research into animal cognition and breakthroughs in AI and effective computing from the technosphere, the radically anti-anthropocentric school of object-oriented ontology has gone the animal rights movement one better by putting things at the center of philosophical inquiries into the nature of existence. According to Ian Bogost, one of the movement's leading thinkers, object-oriented ontology, or triple O as it's sometimes called, maintains that nothing has special status philosophically in terms of ontology. This is not a moral or an ethical argument, you understand. It's entirely within the sphere of ontology, right? The question of the real. Nothing has special status, but everything exists equally. Plumbers, cotton, bonobos, DVD players, sandstone. In contemporary thought, things are either taken as the aggregation of ever smaller bits, scientific naturalism, or constructions of human behavior and society, social relativism. O steers a path between the two, drawing attention to all things at all scales. I'm still quoting from Bogost here. He says, from atoms to alpacas, bits to bleenies, pondering their nature and relations with one another as much with ourselves. And so with a perfectly straight face, they write essays with titles like, Can Rocks Think, right? Or Are Trees Aware? And the question is, how can we know? And also it's a Gedanken experiment, thought experiment, trying to think again outside the anthropocentric. Now on its hairier fringes, O plays footsie with panpsychism, a postmodern reboot of the ancient belief that consciousness permeates all things, which I fear is simply animism for atheists. But if this sounds a bit too woo-woo, consider the mushroom. As the mycologist Paul Stamets notes, animals and fungi share a common ancestor called Opisthokonta. We share about 30% of our DNA with fungi, far more than with any other kingdom, not individual animal. We famously share 98%, I think it's 98% of our DNA with the chimpanzee, but with that kingdom. Making mushrooms some of our closest relatives on the Darwinian tree of life, and for that reason, a 2005 paper in the Journal of Eukaryotic Microbiology, which is never far from my nightstand and should be a constant presence on yours, authored by 20 eukaryotic microbiologists, in which they proposed a new clade, Opisthokonta, that joins Animalia and fungi together at last, after 1.5 billion years. Now, how does this relate to rewilding the web? I can hear you thinking that. In fact, I can see you thinking that. And I'm so glad you did. In a Scientific American article, Stamets notes that mycelium, the filament-like strands of one cell wall thick fungus, is laced throughout the soil. He says there are these vast networks of mycelium everywhere in the ground. In a single cubic inch of soil, there can be more than 8 miles of these cells. The largest organism in the world, in fact, is a mycelial mat. It covers 24 acres in Oregon and is 2,200 years old. Stamets contends that the mycelium is sentient. It is, and this is a quote also, is sentient, it's intelligent, it knows that you're there. And because of the biodiversity of fungi in the ecosystem, he claims when you break a stick or if you're chopping wood, there is this amazing competition of different fungal populations that reach up and try to grab that new nutrition. In one of his TED Talks, he talks about how as you stomp along the forest floor, tendrils of mycelia are snaking up writhingly and following you along. A vision that I find oddly consoling for whatever odd reason, but that's just me. He says, I spent years in front of the scanning electron microscope. I'm sort of persuaded, perhaps too many years. But he says, I could not help but notice that the architecture of mycelium resembled that of neurons, and I postulated in Where Else, the Whole Earth Review, that indeed mycelium is Earth's natural internet. Now I have to admit I went out on a limb on this one, but I was happy to see a group from Oxford at the last International Mycological Congress that had 2 workshops specifically on the mathematics of mycelial networks as a structural form. And when they optimized mycelial networks and the nodes of crossing and looked at internet mathematics and its optimization, lo and behold, the mycelium had achieved a mathematical optimum, the very same as that of the computer internet. See what I did there? Accessing the unconscious by means of free association, illusion, reference, dream logic rather than literalism. Not so much what do I think of this as what does this make me think of in response to Sandy's prompt. The associative, connectionist style of mind, rather than links in a chain of reasoning, fastidiously forged and strengthened with the alloy of hard evidence. André Breton, the self-appointed pope of surrealism, championed that very style of mind, the analogical versus the logical. And these are distinguishing characteristics, I believe, of the creative style of mind, which I'm given to understand is abundantly the ACTLab style of mind. A little instructive etymology. It's my understanding from close perusal of the ACTLab website and long conversations with her nibs, that where art and technology, in the Greek techne, flow together, you fish. Technology in about 1610 comes to mean discourse or treatise on the art or the arts instructively, not the machine kingdom as we now think of it. From the Greek technologia, systematic treatment of an art, craft, or technique, in other words, systems thinking. And it originally referred to grammar from techno. The meaning science of the mechanical and industrial arts arrives on the scene only in 1859, right, in the delivery room of the Industrial Revolution, so to speak. Now, the definition of techne is principles or methods employed in making something or attaining an objective. And I think these definitions chime nicely with the mission statement in a nutshell from the ACTLab website. Quote, our primary emphasis wasn't on computer skills, but on conceptual thinking, self-motivation, group effort, risk-taking, and in screaming uppercase, making stuff. I think you'll have to agree. Making stuff is the quiddity, the very essence of creativity. Now, we live at a historical moment when creativity has never been more voguish among marketing gurus, managerial consultants, life coaches, proselytes of peak performance, and firewalking evangelists of personal growth. A phrase that even to a born and bred Californian has always sounded decidedly tumorous. In his Salon article, TED Talks Are Lying to You, Tom Frank tries to make sense of the curious paradox that while the creative class, of which you're all charter members, has never been more screwed, books about creativity have never been more popular. He inventories, among other leading indicators of this bizarre corporate trend, TED Talks on how to be a creative person, creativity consultants you could hire, cities that had spent billions reworking neighborhoods into arts-friendly districts, where rule-bending whimsicality was a thing to be celebrated. If you listen to certain people, creativity was the story of our time, from the halls of MIT to the incubators of Silicon Valley. The literature on the subject was vast. Its authors included management gurus forever exhorting us to slay the conventional, urban theorists with their celebrations of zesty togetherness, pop psychologists giving the world step-by-step instructions on how to unleash the inner Miles Davis. Most prominent, perhaps, were the science writers with their endless tales of creative success and their dissection of the brains that made it all possible. A sort of a covert dig there at David Brooks that I deeply appreciate, and Malcolm Gladwell, the thinking man's David Brooks. Pop neurology, genetic determinism, all wrapped up in a fortune cookie aphorism. What could be better? Tom Frank traces this genre, at least in its most recent incarnation, to Richard Florida's The Rise of the Creative Class, published to critical huzzas and much brow furrowing by the chattering class in 2002. It's probably throttled back on the snark a bit. It's sort of fairly dripping off the podium here. Firewalk with me. Where were we? Florida's corporate-friendly argument pitched to managerial ears was that creativity was now, quote, the decisive source of competitive advantage. Oh, yes, of course. That's why God invented artists, right? Tom Frank again. Quote, "What was really sick-making, though, was Florida's easy assumption that creativity was a thing our society valued. Our correspondents' creative friends," he's referring to himself, obviously, in the manner of your friend and humble narrator, "our correspondents' creative friends, when considered as a group, were obviously on their way down, not up." And I can vouch for this, having had, seems like every Lyft driver in Austin has a PhD in philology. "Our correspondents' creative friends, when considered as a group, were obviously on their way down, not up. The institutions that made their lives possible, chiefly newspapers, magazines, universities, record labels, were entering a period of disastrous decline. The creative world as he knew it was not flowering but dying." A few fun facts, some bullet points here to buttress Frank's argument. A study released by Citigroup showed that in 2017, only approximately 12% of the music industry's revenue went to artists, which speaks to the financial precariousness of most musicians. Liz Pelly, in her article in The Baffler, Unfree Agents, notes that when Spotify claims its company mission is to have more than 1 million artists be able to live off their art, what they mean by making a living is that these artists must bend to Spotify's will. In the domain of Spotify, making a living demands that an artist acquiesce to what streams well, to what feeds the almighty algorithm, thereby sacrificing their creativity to the tastes of the playlists, chill music, viral artists, sticky pop songs, mood and activity specific music. So artists are now tailoring, in the punning sense of that word, F.W. Taylor, as well as the literal sense, their creativity to what the wise crowd and its infinite wisdom demands. Another example from the New York Times op-ed by Orly Lobel called "My Ideas, My Boss's Property." Increasingly, it's corporations, not people who own inventions. Remember this when you hear the chatter of Seth Godin and Tim Ferriss and Tony Robbins about how, crazy management and out-of-the-box thinking, makes the creative a king. Right? So ownership runs deeper than inventions in an artistic work, says Lobel, extending to ideas, skills, professional ties, tacit knowledge, and social relations that cannot be subject to patent or copyright under the traditional scope of intellectual property, but which corporations lay claim to at increasing rates through employment agreements. Companies have been making more expansive claims to their employees' mental work for over a decade. Many of you may be familiar with the case I'm about to cite. In 2004, a court in Texas ordered a former Alcatel employee to give his former employer a software algorithm which existed entirely in his mind. The Gibsonian vision of them sticking a cable into the SCSI port in the back of your head and vacuuming out all of your illicit thoughts, because their corporate property is not long off. With more corporations demanding that employees pre-assign their intellectual property, there has been a steady decrease in inventor-owned patents. A couple of decades ago, individuals owned about 25% of all patents. Now individuals own barely 10%. The rest are corporate-owned. This in the heyday of creativity, as we're always reminded. New York, once a bohemian mecca, is increasingly a money laundering mill for Abu Dhabi princelings and Russian oligarchs who buy up penthouses in super tall skyscrapers that are so enormous that they are now plunging Central Park into darkness for half the day, creating something called shadow pollution that hilariously is radicalizing Park Avenue residents, pitting, the merely 1% against the 1% of the 1%. Class war at last, every Marxist dream. Excellent. Meanwhile, CEOs are, as everyone knows, obscenely well rewarded. Former NYT CEO was paid a $23.7 million exit package. Janet Robinson, their outgoing CEO, received an exit package of $23.7 million after presiding Here's the punchline. Inevitably, as you can imagine, after presiding over an 8-year tenure that saw the company's share price fall by 80%. The company's net earnings over the past 4 years were a mere $3 million, in addition to her $23.7 million golden parachute. Robinson earned a $1 million annual salary. I yearn for the San Francisco situationists of the 1980s. I was a Los Angeles punk in the heyday of punk, and I thrilled to this ubiquitous poster in San Francisco the year after I graduated. Ever feel like killing your boss? Sodomized again. Today's our lucky day. We've hung the boss and seized the factory. Now let's trash the country. Oh, let me put on my looting clothes. Can anyone tell me why there hasn't risen up a Baader-Meinhof gang of Silicon Valley? Why do we not see blurry domestic terrorist videos of Mark Zuckerberg begging for his life while someone wields a scimitar?
Isn't that what the incels think about Trump? That they've taken over from the inside?
I leave that to you, sir. Of course, the managerial gurus, motivational speakers, life coaches, and marketing evangelists who fill the fertile fields of creativity literature don't have starving artists in mind. That's the answer to the riddle Frank was trying to unriddle. And a neat turnabout, they've rebranded corporate types as creatives, even as the creative class is teetering on the brink of extinction. Creativity is big business, but not for most artists who are consigned to the precariat. This is the cover of Seth Godin's book, his 2011 title, We Are All Weird. Because what could be weirder than a man with a beard? With what appears to be a medieval dunce cap on. This usage, the canny peanut in the shell substitute, the bait and switch of creative, used as a noun, not an adjective, right, for artist, is a usage that only Don Draper could love, and it's instructive. Dictionary.com defines a creative as a creative person, especially one who devises advertising campaigns. American Heritage follows suit. A creative is one who displays productive originality, of course, because all creativity must be productive. I.e., the example they give, the usage is the creatives in the advertising department. So this really does spring from Madison Avenue. Some of you may remember Oliviero Toscani, the architect of the United Colors of Benetton ad campaigns in the 1980s. He caused quite a stir back in the day by claiming that advertising was an art form. Scandalous, right? Utterly non-controversial now in creativity literature. And Don Draper really emerges as the original tormented romantic genius, the Byron of Madison Avenue. Seth Godin, in The Icarus Deception, celebrates the non-hierarchy of artists. And this is an extraordinarily instructive passage. He defines the artist as the painter in front of a blank canvas. No argument there. The architect changing the rules of construction. Ayn Rand would sign off on that one. The playwright who makes us cry. I thought it was laugh and cry. I cried, I laughed. But also the customer service rep who, despite the distance and the rush, makes an honest connection. That's an extraordinary leap. The entrepreneur who dares to start without permission or authority, and the middle manager who transforms the key meeting with a single comment. This is in a book that also includes quotes from Ginsberg on Moloch, from Howell, Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man, and then he says, In his peroration at the end of the book, "Don't waste this platform," he exhorts. "We're living in the first moment in time when 1 billion people are connected, when your work is judged more than ever before." Have you noticed how everything is always more than ever before? It's uncanny. When 1 billion people are connected, when your work is judged more than ever before based on what you do rather than who you are. A revelation that would come as a shock to all those high rollers who tried to bribe their way into Yale for their children. And when access to credentials, access to capital, and raw power have been dwarfed by the simple question, do I care about what you do? We built this world for you. We built it so that you could do what you're capable of. Go. And then he quotes the immortal, "Yes, I said yes, I will, yes," passage from Ulysses, and an exhortation to just do it. For those of you unfamiliar with the book, the irony will fly, in one ear and out the other. But it's a classic of modernist free association and vanguard prose that captures, through its endless run-on sentence, a woman having orgasm. Suffice it to say, it has nothing to console anxious middle managers with, unless their sex lives are more storied than I know. So this is a marketing guru's idea of weird, which is to say, not weird. You want weird? Here in the Vatican of the offbeat and the screw loose. Or at least that's what the city's shrewd self-marketing would have me believe. I'll give you weird. Gérard de Nerval, the proto-surrealist weirdo of the early 19th century, most famous for keeping a lobster as a pet and taking it for a walk on a leash. Le rêve est une seconde vie, declared Gérard de Nerval. The dream is a second life. Before Rimbaud, before the Surrealists, Nerval lived his life as if it were a lucid dream. Of course, it didn't hurt that he was crazy as a pair of waltzing mice. He mapped the psychogeography of Paris in all-night peregrinations that reconciled the flaneur with the somnambulist. He dressed up in Arab garb and drank drug-laced Turkish coffee with Balzac, Baudelaire, and the rest of the hashish-eating Orientalists in the Club des Hashashin. He consorted with fellow bohemians such as Petrus Borel, an inimitable chap who perfumed his beard and went by the nickname the lycanthrope. And Théophile Dondi, who wore spectacles to bed, quote, the better to see his dreams. Nerval died by his own hand at the age of 46, hanged from a window grate with an apron string that he believed to be the Queen of Sheba's garter. For reasons unfathomable to this author, Seth Godin has not cited him as an exemplar of crazy management. Which is, by the way, how's everyone doing? I have 10, 15 minutes more to go. Soldier on? Okay, all right. Thank you. I worry about your blood sugar levels. All right. Excellent. So speaking of crazy management, that, by the way, is where I'd locate the origins of corporate creativity lit in Tom Peters' crazy management ethos, breathlessly invoked throughout the 90s as Holy Writ by Wired magazine, itself the pillow book of would-be corporate rebels. Lol. The Circle of Innovation, 1997, Peters' book, was called the first piece of postmodern management literature by the LA Times. It's a, quote, according to Peters' own site, it's a buzz with bold graphics and chapter titles such as We Are All Michelangelos and Create Waves of Lust. Moses to Godin's Joel Osteen. Peters preached the gospel of weird before it was even an evil gleam in Godin's beady eye. Quote, think weird and learn how to thrive in a disruptive age. On occasion, the cultural illiteracy and artistic tone deafness of marketing gurus and management consultants is pure comedy gold. The best example of this is the transformation of Samuel Beckett's fail again, fail better quote into an image macro and an inspirational meme, a daily affirmation for the irony impaired. It's ranked 104th in the list of the most highlighted passages on Amazon's Kindle website, and it's from The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. Everyone knows Tim Ferriss, the apostle of peak performance and self-improvement. So Ferriss quotes Beckett, "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." And then he says, "You won't believe what you can accomplish by attempting the impossible with the courage to repeatedly fail better." Now, this requires the guilelessness of someone who has undergone ironectomy at birth. The quote is from a piece of writing called Worst Word Ho. And the title says it all, right? And Beckett is an existentialist absurdist, right? I mean, Waiting for Godot, his most famous play, was notoriously reviled as a play in which nothing happens 3 times, right? He, in one of the more marvelous biographies of him, I'm an unreconstructed Beckettian, the author talks about how Beckett cherished the enormous boils that were constantly springing up on the back of his neck so that he could grouse about them. And those of you who saw me speak at the Harry Ransom Center a few months ago will have heard this anecdote there, but I can't resist recycling it. And this really gives you a core sample of the Beckett psyche. You know, Beckett incalculably loved rugby. And was quite a dab hand at rugby in his college years. Also an extraordinarily good golfer, oddly enough. In any event, short story long, after he was well ensconced in his laurels, you know, gorgeously at his ease as the best-known playwright and very handsomely rewarded one, too, in the world, he made the voyage from Paris, where he lived, across the Channel to London. He was with dear old friends, radiantly sunny day, the bluebirds of happiness are chirping in the trees. They're watching a rugby match. Their team is winning. They have their own little tent to themselves. The bubbly is flowing freely. And one dear old chum claps Sam on the back and says, "Spectacular day, isn't it? Makes you glad to be alive." And Beckett stared at him levelly and said, "I wouldn't go that far." So an inveterate gloompot whose oeuvre is one long daily negation, right? Beckett obviously could have benefited from a copy of Ferriss's million-selling book, How to Escape 9 to 5, Live Anywhere, and Join the New Rich. Okay, now I arrive mercifully at my peroration. It's news to none of you that art, by definition, is not utilitarian. You can be creative without being an artist, surely, but being creative doesn't make you an artist. You can't elide the difference between those two things. It just makes you ingenious. Creativity can be harnessed for business purposes, but the essence of creativity has nothing to do with commercial applications or monetizability or giving you the competitive edge or peak performance or utilitarian considerations of any sort. As Oscar Wilde, someone bizarrely that Godin loves to quote, which as a devout Wildian gives me paroxysms of irritation, he probably quotes him because the patron saint of aestheticism is everywhere online. Godin is a self-confessed non-reader. In any event, Wilde memorably observed in the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, "We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. All art is quite useless." I can't tell you how to rewild the web, but I can offer you a few thought experiments, or better yet, parables and homilies. Think of them not as daily affirmations, but as daily aberrations. Self-help for surrealists. Now, I've referred to surrealism repeatedly throughout this talk, and that's because I fervently believe it still has much to teach us, unlike the other movements that are now part of the fossil record of the 20th century. Anyone who fishes, as you do, in the bathypelagic depths of the unconscious, in search of the coelacanths and Vampiroteuthis infernalises, the vampire squids from hell of the imagination, will profit, I believe, from a careful study of surrealism's teachings. Contrary to popular perception, surrealism is not an aesthetic or a school of art, despite the fact that it has been saddled with that perception by the man that the brilliant literary critic Luc Sant referred to as a performing flea, Salvador Dali. It's not even an ideology, but rather a worldview, a state of mind, an oneric politics, a phenomenology for somnambulists. Here are some exercises, some thought experiments, some homilies that you might take to heart to catalyze your creativity in the true sense. Believe devoutly, in ironic quotes. Edward Gorey, about whom I just wrote a biography, abominated organized religion, was never a believer in the occult in any literal sense, but was nonetheless a devotee, unquestionably, of systems of divination, the tarot mostly, which he regarded as a surrealist Taoist trapdoor into the unconscious. He claimed in a letter to a friend to have always, if desultorily and spasmodically, been interested in the occult. He didn't believe literally, but he believed in ironic quotes. For Gorey, the tarot, and this is his own tarot, the Fantod pack, which in place of the traditional suits has the feather, the blue dog, the waltzing mouse, as in Crazy As, the yellow bird, and then Fig Bash, and the black doll, two of his own personal avatars. For Gorey, the tarot, astrology, palmistry, and the I Ching were just so many ways of bypassing the cause and effect rational world in which we normally try to function. By translating reality into a symbolic language, systems of divination show you things, he believed, which otherwise you might have much more trouble finding out. The ultimate goal, he believed, was to internalize the logic of such systems, rendering them unnecessary. Now, his observation that the goal is to internalize the mindset of the I Ching, an ancient method of Taoism closely associated, an ancient method of divination closely associated with Taoism, so that you have direct access to the inexpressible, irresolvable mystery of things, what Taoists call Li, is a profoundly Taoist insight, but it's also surrealist to the core. If for Li we substitute the surrealist concept of the marvelous, always with a capital M. The poetic mystery and uncanny beauty just behind the surface of everyday life. Maintaining an alert, elevated, otherworldly state of mind, the surrealist is ever on the lookout for the marvelous, according to the visual culture critic Rick Pointer, that moment when reality seems to open up and disclose its essence more fully. Thought experiment number 2, or daily aberration number 2. Be your own Freud and your own Analysand. Embrace the logic of free association. Sometimes Gorey's imagination ran riot, extracting multiple meanings from a single object, as was the case with a pair of antique cobbler's tools called lasting pinchers, which he'd found in an antique shop. In his usual flustered, sort of tongue-stumbling way, he told in an interview, "They look vaguely like lizards or something. Combination birds' heads or lizards. Oh dear, it's all so complicated." There was a very famous French horror movie called Eyes Without a Face. This is still Gorey talking. Long before I ever saw the movie, there was a still that was reproduced a lot with a young lady who had been operated on. They were removing her face, and they had those things that pry the skin away, keep the skin separated. So there's this photograph of her lying there with this slight trickle of blood around the outline of her face, with all these instruments attacking her. It impressed me a lot at the time. Anyway, lasting pinchers look kind of like that. If it weren't for Max Ernst, of course, none of this anybody would look at as being... He trailed off and then added, apropos of nothing, "But you know, if you look at this, He held up a pair of pincers. It looks like a person, sort of. And there you have it, an object lesson in the alchemy of free association, which transmutes a thing, natural or human-made, into a surrealist object, defined by the New York gallerist Julian Levy as a concrete realization of the dream or of irrationality under whose uncanny influence reality may begin to assume the dreamed of aspects. Exercise number 4, explore the city in search of the marvelous or the uncanny. Map your own psychogeography by embarking on a dérive. Take a walk in the woods. This is what I call the arboreal uncanny. Max Ernst had mixed feelings when he entered forests, he wrote, delight and oppression, commingled with what romantics spoke of as being at one with nature. But can we ever really be at one with the inscrutably alien? Isn't that anthropomorphizing by any other name? Nature is a figment of the human imagination, no less a social construction than culture, and the woods are an other, capital O. Their brooding presence unfathomable, the sense of a collective consciousness palpable, at least at twilight. Quote, wonderful joy in breathing freely in an open space, wrote Ernst, but also anxiety at being encircled by hostile trees, outside and inside at the same time, free and trapped. The surrealist notion of convulsive beauty exhorts us to embrace ugly beauty, to look for the ugliness in beauty and the beauty in ugliness. I remember being fascinated as a child by the abject objects sealed in shiny shrink wrap in the supermarket meat section, the cow's brains so unnervingly human in appearance, the blood-black livers, the fetishistic pig's feet whose creepy cuteness surely owed something to the associations they triggered in my infant mind of porky pigs' trotters. The rubbery-looking tripe, honeycombed with little lacunae, and best of all, by which I mean worst of all, the obscenely big cow's tongues, gray-fleshed and pimply with papillae. The contrast in the supermarkets of my 60s and 70s childhood between the spotless, scentless meat counter and these Gothic products of the abattoir drove home the dizzy chasm between truth and lie. On one hand, there was the gleaming sterility of the supermarket butcher shop and the dreamy muzak whose soundtrack accompanied my mother's somnambulistic wanderings through the aisles. On the other, the cold fact that somewhere out of view, bawling beasts were being slaughtered. The cutlet, haloed by the pinkish stain on its little styrofoam tray, was dead flesh. You can see that even as a child, I was no different than I am now. As a child, I found these truths unsettling, even as I savored the surrealism of a suddenly defamiliarized reality. And that, by the way, really is the goal of all these exercises, to force defamiliarization, the felicitous alienation that suddenly, in an instant, makes the world alien and new. From a surrealist eye view, meat is murder, but it's also a voluptuous horror, as the painter Francis Bacon pointed out. Ham, pigs, tongue, sides of beef. Any vegans in the audience? Seen in the butcher's window, all that death, I find it very beautiful, and it's all for sale. How unbelievably surrealistic. He also noted that it reminds us that we too are meat, and will soon be dead meat. Food for worms. He said, if you go to some of those great stores where you just go through these great halls of death, you can see meat and fish and birds and everything else all lying dead there. Of course, we are meat. We are potential carcasses. If I go into a butcher shop, I always think it's surprising that I wasn't there instead of the animal. So the alchemy of the surrealist gaze, the mere slight perceptual shift that gives you that perceptual parallax view that allows you to extract all of these transgressive and insurgent meanings from something as banal as the supermarket. Think analogically. This reminds me of that. Exploit the felicitous confusion of paranoid critical method, or if you prefer, the way of the web. totems of a new mysticism. Without warning, a primitive effigy looms suddenly in the dark, caught in the crossbeams of our pocket torches. Regarding us eyelessly with teardrop-shaped sockets, it exudes a kind of malevolent cuteness. Its head is so disproportionately large, it threatens to snap its neck and topple off its squat, misshapen body. Who is this forgotten god? Overgrown by jungle creepers, the last guardian of an ancient civilization swallowed by the forest primeval. A totem of the hypertrophied intellect, a warning against the very tropism toward hyperintellectualism to which a race of philosopher kings succumbed. The patron saint of hydrocephalic children, a Paleolithic premonition of one of Paul Klee's cosmic, grotesque effigies, the pear ubu of a lost world. In fact, it's the packaging for an iPhone, transmuted into something rich and strange by the Surrealist gaze. According to the Surrealist poet Louis Aragon, almost any aspect of modern life is potentially marvelous in the Surrealist sense. He makes the most arbitrary choice of petrol pumps as being the likely totems of a new mysticism. Around this sort of affective interpretation of the world, he says, one might elaborate a modern mythology. Now, since I'm droning on and you've been so very patient, I'm going to skip a few of these last examples and cut straight to the end. So my last thought experiment for you, my last daily aberration, is, of course, be ever vigilant for the marvelous. And the name of this exercise takes its title from the famous Arthur Rimbaud quote, "Je est un autre," I is an other. Emphasize the estrangement from the self, contemplate the self until you become uncanny to yourself. We are our own doppelgangers, or as Daniel Dennett, the philosopher of mind, put it, the self does not exist, it is merely a center of narrative gravity. Taking in the camp exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, I was pleasantly surprised to run into two old friends, one bejeweled by rivulets of horror movie blood, the Grady twins from The Shining. Like seemingly everyone but twins themselves, that is, I've always been fascinated by identical twins, from the dead-eyed twins in the Diane Arbus photo to the uncanny doubles in 19th century carnival banners and circus posters, oddities who are normal in every respect, but their doubleness, an inhuman quality that makes them more freakish than any other marvel in the midway because they make one half of the binary that underwrites Western epistemology vacillate. They destabilize hierarchical dualisms, like mirrors, which Jorge Luis Borges abominated for their sinister asexual replication of the numbers of men. Identical twins, as I noted, destabilize the philosophical binary that more than any other anchors our sense of ourselves, self/other, and by implication, original/copy, truth/falsehood. It's as if the reflection stepped out of the looking glass, inspiring a dizzy swoon into epistemological horror, which is the real and which the simulacrum. Borges was gnawed as a child by the morbid fear that he'd look into one of the many time-darkened mirrors in his family's vast rambling house, and the reflection looking back wouldn't be his. Doppelgangers come to life, identical twins challenge the foundational notion of the unique self, but also the assumption that every mind is anchored in a single body. Twins seem to be of one mind, famously partaking of a shared consciousness. Legendarily, they finish each other's sentences, and the mass imagination teems with tales of a twin telepathically sensing the other's death, even though they're a world apart. It's a fable, of course, but it gets at the deeper truth that bedevils philosophers of mind, beautifully summed in the skin-creepingly uncanny quote from Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, "Who is the I that says I?" I'll leave you with two of my favorite daily aberrations, disquieting passages from Surrealist scripture, guaranteed to unsettle the most unshakably grounded ontology. From the poet Paul Éluard, the quote, "There is undoubtedly another world, but it is in this one." And from the Oulipo experimental novelist Raymond Queneau, the world isn't what it seems, but it isn't anything else either. Think about it.
Stay informed about all things Dery at markdery.com. Special thanks to Heather Barfield, Sandy Stone, ACTLab, and the Vortex Theater for allowing us to record the event. With John Lubkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney, and this is the Protopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.